Once it looked like Trump was going to be the clear nominee, the Alagrovs resurfaced and they said, we are obviously supportive of the Trump campaign, but more importantly, we are doing so with the blessing of the Russian government and with Russian government involvement.
And they promised there would be the delivery of information that would damage Hillary Clinton's campaign.
This is information the Russian government has collected.
Donald Trump Jr. emailed back, "Great, I love it." Here we see what appears to be evidence of collusion.
Donald Trump Jr. forwarded the emails to Paul Manafort, then the campaign manager, and Jared Kushner. They both sat in on the meeting.
Conspiracies are very easy to enter into if indeed there was just a tacit agreement furthering that conspiracy. Boy, they're in, and they're on the wrong side of the law.
And meanwhile, we have George Papadopoulos, foreign policy aide to Donald Trump, who in the spring of last year is running around my town, where I am, London, meeting a mysterious professor with contacts to Moscow.
So George Papadopoulos was a 28-year-old foreign policy aide working for the Trump campaign. Anyway, he met a mysterious Maltese professor called Joseph Mifsud at a conference, and Mifsud, as soon as he learned of the Trump connection, invited him to breakfast, schmoozed him. There were meetings in London hotels featuring a young Russian princess, and they had a series of encounters, and during one of them, Mifsud, who just got back from Moscow, said in April of 2016 that Russia was sitting on tens of thousands of emails hacked from Hillary Clinton, from the Democratic Party. Now, at this point, nobody had any clue that there'd been an enormous cyber operation conducted by the Kremlin. Essentially, the Trump campaign knew well before the Democrats had any inkling that there was all of this hacked material.
President Trump did not attend that meeting, but he also pushed this adoption defense.
In the case of Don, he listened. I guess they talked about adoption and some things.
President Trump continues to defend his oldest son for meeting with a Russian lawyer last year, saying most politicians would have attended. Trump Jr. says the meeting was primarily about the Magnitsky Act. The legislation imposes economic sanctions and travel restrictions on Russians named as human rights abusers. The act is named after Russian tax attorney Sergei Magnitsky. He died in 2009 in a Russian prison where he was held for his work exposing corruption among people linked to the Kremlin.
The Russian government says the cause of death was heart failure, but many observers believe Magnitsky was murdered. Among them is American businessman Bill Browder, who was once the biggest foreign investor in Russia.
I'm a guy who went to Russia to run an investment fund. I discovered corruption, I exposed it, and I fell out with the regime. And in retaliation, they kicked me out of the country, they raided my offices, they seized my investment holding companies and used them to steal $230 million of taxes that I paid to the Russian government.
That I'm Putin's #1 enemy. Now that sounds very self-important, might sound a bit exaggerated, maybe even ridiculous, but when you're done hearing what I have to say, I think you'll conclude that that's the right description.
Our next guest has been named an enemy of the state in Russia after exposing massive corruption there. And President Putin mentioned him during that news conference yesterday. The guys in Russia who hacked into the DNC's server. I mean, there's a kind of a quid pro quo here. You're being likened to Russian intelligence agents who did indeed get into the DNC computer.
Well, there's one very big difference, which is the guys in Russia are criminals. I was the guy in Russia exposing the crimes. So there's no equivalence there at all.
A young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky discovered the crime, exposed it, and he was subsequently arrested, tortured for 358 days, and killed.
And 8 riot guards came into that cell and beat Sergei Magnitsky to death. That was November 16th, 2009, 8.5 years ago. Sergei Magnitsky was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. I got the news the very next morning, and it was the most traumatic, heartbreaking, life-changing news that I could have ever gotten. Sergei Magnitsky was killed because he worked for me.
Since then, I've been on a mission to get justice for Sergei. And that's led to a piece of legislation here in the United States called the Magnitsky Act, which freezes the assets and bans the visas of people who killed Sergei and people who do similar types of things. The Magnitsky Act is now in 7 countries around the world, and Putin hates it with all of his heart.
You say it is Putin's #1 priority to lift these sanctions from the Magnitsky Act. It affects some 44 Russians right now. Why is this such a big deal for Vladimir Putin?
Well, Vladimir Putin is a kleptocrat. For 17 years, he's been taking lots of money from Russia. He's probably the richest man in the world now. And we've been able to trace from the crime that Sergei Magnitsky exposed a $230 million tax rebate fraud. And we've been able to trace some of that money from the fraud to a man named Sergei Roldugin, who was exposed in the Panama Papers as Putin's trustee or nominee. This is the famous $2 billion cellist. And so Putin has gotten some of the money. And because Putin has gotten some of the money, that means that all of Putin's money in the West is potentially exposed and could be frozen. And so this is just a very venal, personal thing for Vladimir Putin, that he doesn't want his money frozen. It was just about the time that Vladimir Putin had come to power. And it turns out that he had been fighting with the same guys I was fighting with. They were stealing power from him at the same time as they were stealing money from me. It turns out that Putin wanted to win his war with these oligarchs. And at the end of 2003, he decided to make his big move. And his big move was to arrest the richest man in Russia, Michael Khodorkovsky, the owner of an oil company called Yukos, off of his jet in Siberia. He brought him back to Moscow, he put him on trial, and he allowed the television cameras to come into the courtroom to film the richest man in Russia on trial sitting in a cage. Now imagine you're the 17th richest man in Russia, you're on your yacht parked off the Hotel du Cap in Antibes, France. You turn on your CNN and there you see a guy far richer, far smarter, and far more powerful than you sitting in a cage. What's your natural reaction? You don't want to sit in a cage yourself. And so one by one, they went back to Putin and said, Vladimir, what do we have to do to not sit in a cage? And he said 50%. Not 50% for the Russian government, not 50% for the presidential administration of Russia, 50% for Vladimir Putin.
To this day, no one, not one person has ever been held responsible for Sergei's death. This despite the fact that the Russian Human Rights Council, established by the Russian president, found that Sergei's arrest was illegal, that he was denied access to justice, and that his treatment amounted to torture.
And I came up with an idea, which is that the people who did this crime did it for money, and they don't keep that money in Russia, they keep that money in the West. And so we came up with an idea, which is to freeze the assets and ban the visas of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky and the people who do this type of thing from anywhere around the world. I took this idea to Washington.
I know that some will try to paint this resolution as anti-Russia. I could not disagree more. I believe it's pro-Russia. I believe that supporting the rule of law is pro-Russia. I believe that defending the innocent and punishing the guilty is pro-Russia. And ultimately, I believe the virtues Magnitsky embodied: integrity, fair dealing, fidelity to truth and justice, and the deepest love of country is pro-Russia. And I would submit that it represents the future that most Russians want for themselves and their country.
And the Magnitsky Act became a federal law on December 14th, 2012. There are now 7 countries that have Magnitsky Acts: the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Gibraltar. And actually the reason I'm here in Germany today is I'm going over to the parliament as soon as I'm done speaking to try to get a German Magnitsky Act.
That was Vladimir Putin's retaliation, right, to the Magnitsky Act, not allowing Americans to adopt Russian babies anymore, Russian children.
So Vladimir Putin was so angry about the Magnitsky Act that he was looking for some type of retaliation. He couldn't freeze assets or do other types of things because the Americans would retaliate against that. And so he came up with the most heartless, vindictive thing he could do, which was Americans were adopting disabled Russian orphans, and he said, no, you can't adopt them anymore.
President Trump personally dictated a misleading letter regarding Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting with a Russian lawyer during the 2016 campaign. According to the Post, on his flight back from the G20 summit, the president wrote that his son had, quote, primarily discussed a program about the adoption of Russian children, emphasizing, quote, it was not a campaign issue at the time.
This exchange on the misleading statement that was put out a year after the Trump Tower meeting by the White House at the time. Quote, the Washington Post has reported that your father was involved in drafting the July 8th statement. Is that correct? The response from Donald Trump Jr. was, I don't know. I never spoke to my father about it.
I remembered being in a room with Mr. Trump, probably in early June of 2016, when something peculiar happened. Don Trump Jr. came into the room and walked behind his father's desk, which in and of itself was unusual. People didn't just walk behind Mr. Trump's desk to talk to him. And I recall Don Jr. leaning over to his father and speaking in a low voice, which I could clearly hear, and saying, the meeting is all set. And I remember Mr. Trump saying, okay, good, let me know.
First, the meeting was with a government official. Second, it wasn't just any government, it was of a foreign adversary. Third, what was being advertised in the meeting and in the emails was support, a contribution, an illegal contribution from a foreign national to the campaign in the form of opposition research. And fourth, the email traffic from the intermediary explicitly said this was part of Russia and the government's support for Donald Trump. If you take all four of those factors combined, it looks a lot different than standard opposition research, which everybody does.
Tough new sanctions on Russia for meddling in the U.S. election. Today, the president did sign it, but without cameras.
For someone who seems to so enjoy a signing ceremony, the White House kept this one behind closed doors, away from the cameras. The president signing it, but issuing scathing words at the same time, calling the legislation seriously flawed. Congress had boxed the president into a corner. The bill passed by an overwhelming veto-proof majority, Democrats and Republicans. The president said he signed it for the sake of national unity, adding, I built a truly great company worth many billions of dollars. As president, I can make far better deals with foreign countries than Congress. Senator John McCain from Arizona, where he is undergoing cancer treatment, saying, I hope the president will be as vocal about Russia's aggressive behavior as he was about his concerns with this legislation.
Well, I have only been in politics for 2 years, but I've had many people call up, oh, gee, we have information on this factor or this person or, frankly, Hillary. That's very standard in politics. Politics is not the nicest business in the world, but it's very standard where they have information and you take the information. In the case of Don, he listened. I guess they talked about, as I see it, they talked about adoption and some things. Adoption wasn't even a part of the campaign.
The first thing that should have happened when the offer for this meeting was made is that someone on the campaign staff should have picked up the phone and called the FBI. It's illegal to accept or solicit donations from a foreign country in connection with an election. And if Donald Trump Jr. didn't know that at this point, although he should have, Paul Manafort, an experienced campaigner, certainly was aware of it. So the most extraordinary feature of this meeting has always been the fact that no one called law enforcement, and that's made even more acute by the fact that the FBI had warned the campaign that they believed that they might be approached by Russians who were trying to interfere with the election.